today was unlock the gates and let the prisoners go free, and I think my only qualifications for that are, as you're saying, the being chaplain, go every couple of weeks to the detention centre up at Maribyrnong, and also occasionally helping out about 5 times or 6 times a year, helping out at remand centre too. So that's the limit of my personal knowledge. Never got myself sent to jail yet, but always time. So, but I think it's a good topic though for Advent, which we're moving into, because to just thinking of prisoners is that basically, if you're reading the Gospel, the Gospel, you've got to say, wants prisoners out of jail. That's what it's about, prisoners out. And I think in Jesus' programmatic speech at the start of the Luke's Gospel, Jesus says that the Spirit of the Lord is upon me. He's anointed me to bring good news to the poor, to proclaim release to the captives, recovery of sight to the blind, and to let the oppressed go free. So release to captives, to prisoners, is central among those things which Jesus promises in the kingdom of God, which is to come. So that's that is pretty central. I think the other thing that is also true is when I was at the detention centre many years ago, we used to have little prayer services rather than Mass, which we have now, but prayer services to which anyone wanted to come. And I found that the most popular, if you like, scriptural reading for the prayer services was the bit in the Acts of the Apostles when Peter sprung from jail. An angel comes along and takes off his chains and opens the gates, and out goes Peter. So people used to love that one, as you can imagine. But okay, so what I want to talk about then today is about prisoners go free. So first of all, to talk a bit about prisons, and then the second half then to talk about prisoners, and the going free bit will come through each section. So I think the first question is why prisons? These are big questions, aren't they? But why do we have prisons, and why must we have prisons? And I suppose the reason for that is that our society needs to, I suppose, assure people that they will be safe, and safe to get on with their everyday lives, which means safe in predicting that how much money they have in the morning will be how much they have later. No one will have knocked it off. That if they do go down to the bank to bank it, that they're not going to be hit on the head on the way and things like that. So that safety is, that sense of safety is so important in society, isn't it? And it's perhaps one of the things which is, I think, some causing bad policy at the moment is just a little bit of public unsureness about safety. So if robbery and violence are licensed, well then society breaks down, doesn't it? So in order to ensure that then, to keep people safe, then you need to take precautions to do that. So, and that includes to making sure that people who offend against other people lose something by it. They don't gain. There's no gain in crime, that crime doesn't pay. They need to keep people physically safe from assault and other things by, if there are dangerous people, that they need to be either monitored or placed in a safe place, I suppose, and they need to deter people from offending. And I think probably most important of all is just to establish, if you like, the rule of justice, to make sure that there is an ideal and there is built into society just practices and just expectations. And then finally to encourage people who do wrong things to change their ways. So these are the kind of things which society needs to do, and it needs to do all of them. The most important of those, if it can be done, is to persuade people to change their ways. Because if people just keep on being violent and robbing and so forth, then the number will increase. If you can encourage people to change into a more social way of life, then clearly the expense, the time, the energy, the anxiety in society will be lessened. Does that make sense? So that's why prisons then. Well, prisons are really only one way of ensuring that people are safe. The trouble is, I think, in our society, is that prisons have become pretty much in people's mind the only way. If you don't send people to prison, then you're not deterring people, that people are going to be unsafe, they'll return, etc., etc. But even in our society, there are many other ways too. There are fines, aren't they? You can fine people and you can sentence them to community service, which takes away lots of opportunities, I suppose, for income and things like that if you're sentenced to community service. Correction orders, freedom under surveillance, and also mediation, meetings with victims, which are often very effective in changing the attitudes of the people who commit crime. So there's all of these things which are available to us if we want to use them to assure that society is safe, and to promote change, and as I say, to help people feel that. Okay, so, but that said, prisons are necessary, I think, in our society. They're necessary because there are enough people who really are a standing danger to the community, and so that and they're the ones that we tend to read about in the press, aren't we? People are let out on parole and then they assault someone, or else they commit a murder or whatever. And so there are people for whom either by mental illness or by total lack of identification with other people, total, if you like, self-centeredness with no sense of other people's feelings or other people's rights, that they in fact are a danger. And so if they have committed crime, well then the protection of the community might demand then that they spend time in prison. So that's what prison's for. And so to take away that risk of uncontrollable violence and danger to danger to society more generally. But I think I would say what has become problematic in our society is that they're pretty much seen as the only response to antisocial behaviour. And so whenever anybody does anything that's unacceptable, the cry from particularly the tabloid media or the shock jocks, but particularly the more popular media might say, not to mention social media, is lock them up and chuck away the key. Is that right? And so I think look at some of the Herald Sun, I guess, headlines, and you get the kind of picture. And so the media and victims demand harsher sentences, and even for children, and harsher custodial sentences, harsher prison sentences. And not only that though, then governments yield to that pressure, because if they don't, the government is thought to be betraying its trust to keep the people safe. And so to keep people safe, then we get heavier sentences, absence of many of the things that contribute to people reintegrating with society, like parole and like diversion programs, these kinds of things, and make it, in fact, much more likely that people will reoffend. And that leads then to the multiplication of jails, and the cost of those, the money that's put into those jails is taken away from remedial programs, but it's also taken away from the hospitals and schools, which governments also have a duty to provide. Does that make sense? We can argue about these things later, but that's how I see it. I should stop there and say, you can hear me all right, can you? Okay, good. Yeah. I think if St Andrew was the patron saint of throats and so forth, I've got a sort of rather recurrent cough and tickle in the throat, which tends to put my voice down. Might pray to him sometime. So second bit then of this talk then is prisoners. And I think the best place to start really, if you're thinking of prisoners, is not to think of prisoners as a group, but to imagine, to see the faces of people in prison, because prisoners are above all people. And I guess that's the Vinnie. If you sum up, I guess Vinnie's in a line, isn't it? That everyone are people. That there's no exclusion in the people whom we serve, either by virtue or by fortune or by race or whatever. So Vinnies are people. Vinnies are people. Here they are people. Yeah, you're people. Prisoners are people too, and prisoners have faces. And so just start off with, there's one guy I met in remand. It was a lovely meeting. This was a guy with a hugely lived-in face who came up from around the Murray area, and he was just saying that, you know, his time in prison had actually, time in remand had brought him close to God, and so prison was doing him some good, can do sometimes. But and he just realised the error of his ways. He was down there really because he had been heavily on ice, and I imagine it led, you know, he's a gentle man to meet. Imagine that had led him to act violently and to intimidate his family and so forth. So that's where he was in remand. But he discovered God in prison, and he'd realised his error. His error was this: that ice was man-made, and God disapproved of things that were man-made. But grass, marijuana, that was a plant, that was God-made. So when he went back up the Murray again, he was going to restrict himself to grass. And I was nodding seriously to this, thinking the result was a good one, even if the argumentation I wondered about as a theologian. But all the same, but it was just that lovely, there's a lovely humanity, wasn't there, in the engagement. You know, you recognise myself so much in that man with the way I kid myself when I need to and want to, and so forth. So, as I say, prisoners are people, and they're people with faces. And I must say, I just find myself, it's just wonderful really being, it's not wonderful that they're there, but it's just the company of those people is it's a privilege. I guess they're the people I always tell them at Mass, you know, that it is a privilege to be with you guys. They're all men at that jail, but with you guys, because you're the sort of people that Jesus wanted to be with and was with. So for a priest, there's no better privilege than that. So prisoners are people. But prisons therefore can sometimes lead to illumination, and sometimes give people a chance to reflect on their lives, generally in the remand stage. But on the whole, though, they're totally counterproductive when it comes to changing attitudes and changing behaviour, and that has consequences for society. So question then is about prisoners then. Who are the prisoners? Who is in prison? That is just my observation, and I think it's borne out by the surveys that are done on the matter. Are most people there, the ones I met, I would say the majority are mentally ill. So prisons are a holding place for the mentally ill. And so usually a typical crime, if you like, is, and particularly it's addiction and mental health problems go together, so that somebody will be off their medication, and then they'll act quite inappropriately in one way or another, and then they'll be sent to jail. That's the sort of pattern. So so the mentally ill who have forgotten to take their pills. Indigenous Australians are overrepresented, absolutely massively so. I think in Northern Territory, I think the proportion of people of Indigenous population in jail, the percentage of the Indigenous population in jail is about it's twice to three times as high as it is in the United States, which is about the highest country in the world for incarceration. So that's Indigenous Australians. Also, I think the other group perhaps are recent migrants, and usually young men, recent migrants. So I think at the moment it tends to be, it's Sudanese, African immigrants about whom that anxiety exists. But as in the time I've seen it, it's also been about Turks, it's been about Lebanese, it was about Vietnamese earlier, it was about young Italian kids after the war, and it was about I guess it was about my ancestors earlier. It was about the Irish. So these kind of scare campaigns that the people who are causing anxiety, as far as I'm concerned, they're family. That's just part of goes with the turf of being a young immigrant struggling to find work, struggling to find connection, often with great tensions within family as family is settling, little stability in the house, etc., etc. And I think the other thing, though, that I found quite striking, really, is that the prisoners at least in remand, I can almost predict where they're going, one of the safe questions you can ask, are you from Melbourne, etc., and then they'll say, oh yes, I'm from Richmond, or I'm from Collingwood, or I'm from Baldwin, or wherever. But the majority of them really come from very, very few postcodes. Some rural cities. I suppose Benalla and Wang seem to be fairly highly represented. But that if it's Melbourne, there's a very high chance they'll be from Frankston. And perhaps others from around Broadie too. So there's relatively few areas they come from. And if you look at those areas, these are areas of very, very high disadvantage. That is to say that people in those areas are more likely to come from dysfunctional families. They're likely to have had very little care as children, lacking in childcare. Their access to education, their education has been broken. They come from families in which there is addiction, and they themselves become addicted. Oftentimes family members have been in trouble with the police, they've been in contact with the justice system, etc. So if you look at the areas of disadvantage where children, if you like, when they're growing up, you would say, don't really have too much of a fair go. These areas are very highly represented. But they're also areas in which government services are particularly lacking too. So great need and little resource. And the thing about disadvantage is if you are disadvantaged in one way, just statistically, you're much more likely to have a whole range of disadvantages. If you do come from, say, dysfunctional family and there's addiction in the family, you are much more likely to have your education has been an experience of failure to you, and you won't have found work if you're a young adult. So, does that make sense? Yeah. You know, that's so that again, that's the people in jail. So, if you like the jails, then if you just look at who people are, you know, they're really holding pens for people into whom society hasn't put the resources to be able to enable them to live flourishing lives as children first, but then to grow into be flourishing adults. So, so that's the who are in jail. So, if you want, the answer to the question, I suppose, who are jails for? The tabloid answer, of course, is for monsters, isn't it? That monsters, callous, etc., multiply the adjectives. But in fact, when you look at it, another way to say jails are for the disadvantaged, and particularly for the mentally ill. So that again gives us reason to think. So the question then is, okay, if that's who's in prisons, that's what prisons are, then what do prisons do? What do prisons do for people? Do they help them? I think sometimes they do. I think Immigration Detention Centre early on, I remember meeting, there was a woman there who she had been trafficked, she'd been sold by her parents from Burma, I think, across the border into Thailand, worked as a domestic slave till she was about 7, I think, then sent down into the brothels in Bangkok. When she was worn out there, she was sent to Malaysia, and when she was worn out there, she was sent to Australia. You know, that's that trafficking kind of pattern. And that I remember when I met her first in the detention centre, she just came up and said, I want pills. And pills, of course, were to end her life with. You know, she wanted to die. But she spent some time there, but I think that was I suppose it was the first experience she'd really had in her life of men who didn't molest her, you know, who actually were either neutral or were decent. And she also had there's a sister there who was taught English, and they developed a friendship. And so when she eventually got out, and then I think she did a degree at Swinburne, and then just integrated into the community. So that's the case, isn't it, where being imprisoned actually had good effects. But I say that, I think you've got to recognise that, but it's not the usual story. Because what prisons normally do for people who are there is it prepare people to return to prison. Over 60% of people who are sentenced in prison return there, they commit crimes again, which will put them again in prison within 2 years. So that's what prisons prepare for, and so prisons perpetuate prisons. Why do they do that? You know, why has it got that result? And I don't think it's not the monster argument doesn't hold, but when you think about it, what prisons do is they separated people who are isolated and often in fragile relationships, but which are dear to them, with young children, say, with partners, and partners are often very precarious themselves. They may be on drugs or whatever. It separates people from their connections, from family, from friends, from workmates, from children, from grandparents and parents, and from their routines. So prison is altogether about separation. But if you're going to live in the community, what they need, they've had that experience. Separation has just been so much a part of their lives. You know, their skills in relationships aren't great sometimes, so there's a whole series of partners, relationships that they've been in, or whatever, and that all of those things which you need in order to function in society in a social way, a sociable way, all of those things are stripped away from from people who are in jail. So their whole connections with society are separated. So when people go out, they just leave prison, and there's very little. There's really no, hardly any programs which will help them once they're out of jail. What do? You know, they go back to basically to where they were, without employment, with often more tension in their relationships there, and so oftentimes they'll fall back into whatever they were doing before. And but not only that, I think they separate people also from society in terms of employment opportunities. You know, we've all, I suppose, at some stage had to fill in a sort of a CV. And it's not too often that somebody will put on their CV, or will be employed if they do. There was Langy Kalkal, or there was Melbourne City, the Remand Centre, or Port Phillip, or whatever. It just doesn't get you a job usually, does it? In fact, I think again, there are exceptions. I think the Jesuit Social Services dinner, we had a speaker who I thought was going to be very boring. You know, he had a double-barrelled name, and he was high up in the Sydney Public Service. So, and he'd been to a Jesuit school, so I thought, no, this is going to be as boring as all come out. But so they're reading down this CV that he had, and so you know, we settled into 20 minutes or so before these sweets came out, and but then he started off by saying, that they left off something from my CV, which is really very significant to who I am. I spent 2 years in Long Bay, and they've been dealing drugs, and really big time drugs, I think, and his connections managed to get him through, I think, the good family he came from. But it's not often, isn't it, that people own to that as on their CV, and it's not let alone see it as something to be proud of, really, proud of coming through that experience, not what they'd done before. But for most people, it just cripples you with employment, doesn't it? It's not a pastor being a government minister, unless you're in the United States at the moment, aren't it? Thirdly then, that prisons, what do prisons do? They also take away security. You know, prisons breed fear. There are people there who can't control find it very difficult to, they find it very difficult to control their emotions and control their impulses, and who are very exploitative of others. And so prisons, you've always got to watch your back or have someone watching your back. So they take away security, and that again, if insecurity as a preparation for getting back into society, not great. They also, I think, they model how to live, in fact, in an adversarial society where people are hostile to one another, or at least the hierarchies, authority and people who obey is very sharply distinguished. And so where there's really constant humiliation, that the guards can say anything they like to you and you've got no comeback, or they just need to look at you, and every time you need to be searched when you go from one section to another. So these are, if you like, authoritarian places, need to be, for say security, I suppose. But it means, but they're places of humiliation And so if people's problem, as it usually is, of one, a very poor self-image, poor opinion of themselves, people aren't proud or arrogant, they're desperately down on themselves usually. Persuade them that try to persuade them that God loves them is, you've got to say again and again and again, and it's hard for people to believe. So once again, that kind of, what does that mean if you come out feeling worse about yourself, therefore not really caring, I'm a waste of space, so I might as well act as a waste of space, then that's what happens. And finally, they lack effective, partly because they've got too many people are being put in them, they lack effective programs to overcome addiction and unemployment and to reintegrate with society. So that's prison. So why don't prisons work? Why are they counterproductive? Well, that's why they're counterproductive. Is it sensible then to put people who are already disadvantaged in so many ways in places which are going to exacerbate those disadvantages? Well, the answer to my mind is no. So what can be done? And that's the final few minutes. I think if we're thinking about what can be done, it's not easy. Prisons are needed, and and public anxiety needs to be allayed. As at the moment, I think there's great anxiety, isn't there, about young people running around sort of hijacking cars and bashing women, and all of the stories that we're seeing in the press, and people are anxious. That anxiety does need to be allayed, but I think it needs to be allayed by reason rather than by targeting people. So I would say that the first thing to do is to privilege non-custodial sentences, which is anything but jail. Privilege those where you can. And why drug addiction and minor drug trafficking should attract prison sentences, I find that very hard to understand. It's just, it's not that you're cutting off people's supply necessarily in jails, and it certainly makes it pretty likely that they'll be back on them when they go out. So non-custodial sentences, which community service, just working on just intense programs of therapy, of helpful therapies and so forth would be much better. I think the second thing, the postcode business also needs to be addressed. That if there are areas in which people are disadvantaged in so many ways and the outcomes are so disastrous, and the disasters of people being in jail are just one area of disaster, then I would think that governments really need to put great resources and community agencies in a coordinated way in those areas, not having 20 different agencies not talking to one another, but working it so that there's somebody who is working with and bringing in the resources as needed for young families, for children, in school programs, anger management programs for young people, etc., etc., etc. That it seems to me is key. And I think if people are in jail, then make sure they're followed up when they're out of jail. It's no use cutting out parole and then just dumping people on the street, which is effectively what's being done at the moment. You must have a transition program for people into the community. And once you've done that and they've been effective, you're going to save a lot of money on building jails. We'll put some of that money into hospitals and schools, and we'd all benefit, wouldn't we? And I think finally then, just in communities, just to encourage people in the community, and I suppose among ourselves too, to visit prisons and prisoners. They have there's a good group of people up at the various jails who go regularly, but that that's one of the works of mercy, isn't it, in the gospel? That is, again, such an important way of just building connection with people. So thank you.